On the morning of the 26th of October, 1440, a man who had once ridden into battle beside Joan of Arc, a marshal of France, one of the wealthiest nobles in the entire kingdom, stood on a meadow across the river from Nantes, and asked the crowd that had come to watch him die to pray for his soul. He had a rope around his neck and a fire already built beneath the scaffold. Minutes earlier, he had turned to the two servants who were going to hang beside him and told them to die bravely, to keep their eyes fixed on heaven, to think of nothing but God in their last moments. And the people who had gathered to see Gilles de Rais executed, among them the families of the children he had supposedly butchered by the dozen, wept for him. They followed his body to the church afterward. Some of them, by the accounts we have, knelt and prayed for his salvation with what looks like real, uncomplicated grief. That is the part nobody has ever fully managed to explain. Not the killings themselves, horrifying as the trial laid them out. The fact that the parents of dead children mourned the man who had just confessed, in open court, to murdering their sons. Either he was a monster so complete that the medieval mind simply could not file him under monster, or something happened inside that courtroom at Nantes that we are still, nearly 600 years later, not seeing clearly. Both of those possibilities have kept serious people arguing for centuries, and neither one of them sits comfortably. Before we get any deeper into him, hello and welcome in. Good to have you here, however you stumbled onto this one. If you're new around here, I do these long, slow walks through the stranger corners of history, the stories that refuse to wrap up neatly, the ones that leave you turning them over for days afterward. I genuinely love to know where in the world you're listening from, so do me a favor and drop a comment telling me your city, your country, whatever corner of the map you're sitting in right now. And to the people who keep this channel alive, who support what happens here, thank you sincerely from the bottom of it. None of these videos would exist without you. All right, back to the meadow and the man standing on it with the rope around his neck. Gilles de Montmorency Laval, Baron de Rais, sometimes you'll see it spelled Retz, was born around the year 1405 at the castle of Champtocé-sur-Loire, into a family so thickly braided with noble blood that he stood to inherit three of the great lineages of Western France at once: the houses of Laval, of Craon, of Rais. His mother and father both died while he was still a boy, and so he was raised instead by his maternal grandfather, a hard, grasping, relentlessly acquisitive old man named Jean de Craon. And the grandfather seems to have impressed two lessons on the child above all others: that the family fortune was a sacred thing to be enlarged at every opportunity, and that very little in this world was truly off-limits in the pursuit of more of it. Marriages could be arranged by abduction if necessary, rivals could be crushed. The law was an obstacle to be managed, not a wall to be respected. The grandfather actually demonstrated the principle in the flesh. Gilles' marriage to Catherine de Thouars was pushed through in the teeth of church objections about the couple being too closely related, an obstacle that stopped lesser families and simply didn't stop Jean de Craon. He wanted the Thouars wealth joined to the family, and so it was joined, blessing or no blessing. A boy raised watching that learns a particular thing about how the world yields to a man with enough will and enough land. Gilles grew up inside that worldview, rich beyond what almost anyone alive at the time could imagine, with an annual income that a later legal document set at something in the neighborhood of 50,000 livres. He could read Latin fluently. He loved books, music, ceremony, the bright machinery of spectacle. By the surviving accounts, he was clever, genuinely charming when he chose to be, and so accustomed to getting precisely what he wanted, that the idea of being denied anything probably never fully landed for him. In 1420, he was married off to Catherine de Thouars, another wealthy heiress, the union stitching together estates across Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou into one enormous unbroken block of land and money and men. He was around 15. Around that same stretch of years, still barely more than a teenager himself, he played a part in springing the Duke of Brittany loose from a kidnapping, and he and his grandfather were rewarded richly for the service. Look at the shape of his early life, and a pattern stands out almost immediately. For Gilles, violence and reward arrived bundled together from the very start. He learned young that a sword swung in the right cause on behalf of the right people made you richer and more powerful rather than getting you punished. That's a dangerous thing for any young man to internalize. It's a more dangerous thing for one who will eventually have no one left who can tell him no. Then came the war and the girl. From about 1427 onward, Gilles fought for Charles VII against the English in the long, grinding, demoralizing slog of the 100 Years' War. The French cause was in genuinely desperate shape, and in the spring of 1429, Gilles found himself attached to the single most extraordinary military operation of the entire age. The relief of Orléans, led, or at the very least inspired and driven, by a teenage peasant girl from Lorraine, who insisted that God himself had sent her to put the crown on the rightful king's head. Joan of Arc. Gilles was one of the captains who escorted her convoy. He fought at her side at the storming of the Bastille of Saint-Loup. He was there at Jagiellon, there at Patay, in the run of victories that broke the English grip and turned the war's momentum. He rode with Joan all the way to Rais for the coronation of Charles VII, the whole point of her mission, the moment she'd staked everything on. And there, on the 17th of July, 1429, at perhaps 24 years old, Gilles de Rais was made Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors the kingdom could bestow. The crown granted him the rare and dazzling privilege of adding the royal fleur-de-lis to his own coat of arms. The only other person to receive that same honor in the whole Orléans campaign was Joan herself. He kept fighting for a while after the coronation too, and did it well. In the summer of 1432, he was among the captains who helped lift the siege of Lagny, one of his more celebrated feats of arms, the sort of action that confirmed his reputation as a genuine soldier rather than a nobleman playing at war from a safe distance. The military Gilles was not a fraud. He was good at it. He had stood in real danger beside the most famous woman in France and come out of it decorated and admired. That's worth holding on to, because the man the trial would later describe seems like he belongs to a different person entirely, and squaring those two versions of him, the marshal and the monster, is part of what nobody has ever quite managed. Sit with that picture of him for just a second. because it's the high point of his entire life, and everything after it bends downward. Young, decorated, one of the great soldiers of France. His name linked directly to the holiest, most luminous figure of the age, a girl already being spoken of in the language reserved for saints. If you had been told in the summer of 1429 that this man would end his life on a scaffold as the most notorious child killer in French history, you would have laughed. There was no version of his future, standing in that cathedral at Reims, that pointed anywhere but up. He had everything: rank, wealth, glory, the favor of the king, a name that would be remembered. And within little more than a decade, he had thrown nearly all of it into a fire, in one sense or another. Joan was captured in 1430, and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431, and Gilles seems to have drifted away from the war not long after she was gone. His most powerful protector at the royal court fell from favor in 1433. His grandfather, the old miser who had spent decades acting as a brake on the family's spending, the one man whose authority Gilles still respected, died that same year. And with the brakes finally and permanently off, Gilles began to incinerate one of the largest fortunes in France at a speed that genuinely alarmed his own relatives. The spending was not ordinary aristocratic excess. It was something closer to compulsion. He commissioned and staged a vast theatrical production about the siege of Orléans, a kind of enormous live reenactment with hundreds of performers, and reportedly had brand new costumes made for every single performance, and then simply gave them away afterward, the whole cloth of gold lot of them, never to be reused. He kept a private chapel staffed with its own boys' choir, the children dressed in finery worthy of a great cathedral, and he hauled this entire travelling apparatus of devotion and display around with him from castle to castle like a portable royal court. To pay for all of it, he began selling land, then more land, then more. By 1435, his family had grown so frightened by the rate of the collapse that they went directly to the king and obtained a royal edict forbidding Gilles from selling off any further estates. An extraordinary, humiliating public declaration that one of France's great lords could no longer be trusted with the management of his own property. It worked only in part. The edict had no force inside the borders of Brittany, so within the duchy the hemorrhage simply continued. And there's a particular bitterness in the picture of it. This was a man selling off castles that had been in his family for generations, the inheritance his grasping grandfather had spent a lifetime defending and enlarging, and he was selling them to fund choirs and costumes and a private religious establishment of almost royal scale. He surrounded himself with beauty and ceremony and music, while the foundation of it all dissolved under him. He kept the choir even as the lands went. Whatever was driving him, ordinary financial sense was not part of it. A proud man bleeding money in the 15th century, desperate, unwilling to live smaller, unable to imagine himself as anything less than magnificent, eventually arrives at the same door that a great many desperate men have arrived at across history. Alchemy, the intoxicating promise that base metal could be transmuted into gold, that the right ritual performed by the right practitioner with the right help from the right unseen powers could refill an emptied treasury overnight. Gilles went looking for someone who could deliver it. He brought in practitioners, hosted experiments, paid for equipment and books and the services of men who claimed to know the hidden arts. Most of them, predictably, failed and moved on or were sent away. The fortune did not come back. It was never going to, and the longer it didn't work, the further into the dark the search seems to have gone. What he found, brought up from Florence around 1439, was a young Italian cleric named Francois Prelati. Prelati was somewhere in his early 20s, educated, smooth-tongued, and he claimed he could summon a demon. The demon even had a name, Baron, and Prelati promised that Baron could provide knowledge and wealth and power, provided he was approached in exactly the correct manner and paid in the particular currency he preferred. The invocations, by the account that came out later, followed a grim and specific choreography. Prelati would trace a circle on the ground with the point of a sword. Gilles would step inside that circle carrying a written pact, signed in his own hand, offering the demon nearly anything, everything he could want. The document is said to have read, with two exceptions only: not Gilles' soul, and not the shortening of Gilles' life. Everything else was on the table, and then the two men would wait in the dark for the powers to answer. By Gilles' own testimony at trial, the demon never once appeared to him. He never saw it, never heard it, never exchanged a word with it. It was always Prelati who reported back afterward. Baron had come, Baron was displeased, the offerings were insufficient. What the demon truly required was the body of a child, the hand, the heart, the eyes. And Gilles, according to the trial record, supplied exactly that, sealed up in a glass vessel and handed it over to the magician to present to the powers in the dark. Which is where the worst of this begins, and where I'm going to slow right down, because the things the court at Nantes accused Gilles de Rais of are about as black as anything in the entire medieval record, and they deserve to be stated plainly and soberly rather than dressed up for effect. There's no version of this that isn't horrifying, and trying to make it more horrifying would be its own small obscenity. The prosecution's case was that beginning around 1432 or 1433, the same stretch when his grandfather died and his last restraint died with him, Gilles had been systematically abducting and murdering children, mostly boys. Mostly poor ones, somewhere between roughly 6 and 18 years old, the sons of laborers and beggars, orphans, runaways, the children whose disappearance might be mourned with bottomless grief by a family, but would never trouble the conscience or the calendar of a powerful man. They were lured to his various castles, to Champtocé, to Machecoul, to Tiffauges, to his townhouse in Nantes, with promises, food for a hungry child, a position as a page in a great lord's household, simple charity from a generous nobleman. Some were brought in by his own servants. Others were procured for him by 2 women who roamed the surrounding countryside identifying likely targets, one of them remembered in the records under the genuinely chilling nickname La Meffraie, which carries the sense of the terror, the one who frightens. Once a child crossed the threshold into the castle, the child did not come back out. The pattern of the disappearances, when investigators later pieced it together from the testimony, had a grim regularity to it. A child would be seen near one of the castles, or would be known to have gone there looking for work or food or alms, and then would simply be gone, and the family would be left to wonder. A boy sent to beg at the gate of Machecoul who never came home, a young apprentice who went up to deliver something and vanished. A child offered a place tending horses, whose mother watched him walk up the road and never saw him again. Spread across years, in a countryside where children did sometimes die or drift away or get taken by illness, each single disappearance could be explained away, mourned privately, absorbed into the ordinary losses of a hard century. It was only when someone finally gathered all those private griefs into one place and laid them side by side that the shape of the thing appeared. A household that children entered and did not leave, over and over, in the same few parishes, for the better part of a decade. The horror wasn't in anyone vanishing. It was in the accumulation, the sheer arithmetic of empty places at how many tables. The confessions, given by Gilles and separately by his servants, described sexual assault, prolonged torture and killing, all of it carried out, the court concluded, for Gilles' own pleasure and gratification. Decapitation features heavily. There is the particularly awful detail that he would sometimes have the heads of the most beautiful murdered children kept and arranged so that he could admire them afterward, even kiss them, comparing them to decide which had been the fairest. One of his servants, a man called Etienne Corillot, known as Poitou, gave testimony so unsparing and so specific that a modern historian, a man who has read more Inquisition records than almost anyone now living, said flatly that he had never encountered anything comparable on paper anywhere in the medieval sources, nothing of that register of described cruelty, until you reach the Marquis de Sade 3 centuries later. The bodies, the confessions said, were burned in the great fireplaces of the castles, the ashes and the bones disposed of, the children's clothing destroyed so that nothing remained. The numbers thrown around at trial were enormous and impossible to pin down. The indictment spoke of 140 children or more. Other accounts climbed higher still into figures that no one could ever confirm or refute, because there were no bodies. There were never any bodies. There was ash in fireplaces, and there was testimony, and there was the very real, very countable absence of a great many children whose parents came forward to swear that their sons had gone to the Lord's house and simply never returned. Now, if killing on anything close to that scale was happening across the better part of a decade, you'd reasonably want to know how a man gets away with it for that long. And the blunt answer is one that medieval history serves up over and over. He was a marshal of France. The victims were, in the cold arithmetic of the time, nobodies, the children of the powerless, and a grieving, frightened peasant woman in Machecoul, whose boy had vanished after going up to the castle, had essentially nowhere to turn. No court that would hear her, no protector who would carry her accusation against one of the greatest lords in the land and expect to survive making it. Justice in the 15th century did not flow uphill. It almost never has. It took something completely unrelated to murdered children to bring Gilles de Rais down, and the something unrelated is one of the stranger ironies in the whole affair. There's one more detail from the testimony that historians point to because it speaks to something beyond pure cruelty. It speaks to caution, to a man who knew he had things to hide. When Gilles parted with the castle of Champtocé, he reportedly arranged beforehand to have the remains of children removed from it, gathered up and carried away to another of his properties, so that whoever took possession would find nothing. Servants described moving the bones of the dead out of one castle and into another, quietly, ahead of the handover. That isn't the behavior of a man who believed he was doing nothing wrong, or who thought himself wholly untouchable. It's the behavior of someone managing evidence, and for the historians weighing whether the confessions describe real events, that single logistical detail, the moving of small bodies from one house to another ahead of a sale, has always been one of the harder things to set aside as invention, because it's so specific and so practical, so unlike the sort of thing a torturer's script would think to put in a frightened man's mouth. In May of 1440, Gilles did something arrogant and stupid. He had sold one of his castles, Saint-Étienne-de-Mer-Morte, and then come to regret the sale, and on the 15th of May he simply showed up and took it back by force. Worse, far worse in terms of the trouble it would bring down on him, he did it during the celebration of Mass, storming into the church with a double-edged axe in his hands and seizing a priest named Jean Lefebvre, the brother of the man who had bought the property, laying violent hands on a cleric inside a consecrated church, brandishing a weapon at the altar. That crossed a line the powerful genuinely cared about, in a way that the deaths of 100 peasant children apparently had not. It trampled on the rights of the church, and it insulted the authority of the Duke of Brittany within his own domain, both in a single reckless morning. And the Bishop of Nantes, a formidable man named Jean de Malestroit, who was also the Chancellor of Brittany, and in practical terms the most politically powerful single figure in the entire duchy, took very keen notice. Malestroit opened an investigation, and the moment the bishop's men began quietly working their way through the region, asking careful questions about the conduct of Gilles de Rais, the parents started, at last, to speak. The investigators gathered testimony all through the early summer of 1440, one grieving family after another, and on the 29th of July the bishop published his findings, and the findings reached vastly beyond an assaulted priest and a seized castle. They described a years-long pattern of vanished children. Gilles was arrested in September at Machecoul by a man acting in the Duke's service. What followed were two trials running in parallel. One was secular, the Duke's court, concerned with the abductions and murders of the children and with the armed seizure at Saint-Étienne. The other was ecclesiastical, presided over by Bishop Malestroit together with a vice-inquisitor, and it charged Gilles with murder, with sodomy, with the invocation of demons, and with heresy. The church court drew up 49 separate articles of accusation and read them out, and at the start, Gilles refused to cooperate at all. He flatly denied that the court had any right to sit in judgment over him. He called his judges corrupt, simoniacs, ribalds, men who bought and sold holy office, and declared that he would sooner be hanged than answer to the likes of them. So the court excommunicated him, and for a believing Christian in 1440, excommunication carried a terror that's genuinely hard to feel the full weight of from where we sit now. To be cut off from the church was to be cut off from the sacraments, from communion, from absolution, to face the real prospect of dying with the gates of heaven barred, and an eternity of hellfire waiting on the other side of a death that, given his circumstances, was clearly coming soon. The two proceedings fed each other. While the bishop's court worked on the heresy and the demon summoning, the duke's officers were taking depositions from witnesses about the missing children and from Gilles' own household servants. And the servants are where a lot of the most damning material came from, because they had been there, in the rooms, allegedly holding the children, allegedly disposing of the bodies. Two men in particular, Henriette Griart and Etienne Corillot, the one called Poitou, gave detailed confessions of their own, separately from their master, describing how the children were brought in, how they were killed, how the remains were burned and the ashes scattered. The fact that the servants' accounts and Gilles' account broadly lined up, even though they were taken apart from one another, is one of the things that has weighed heavily on historians ever since. It's hard to coordinate a lie that's consistent across multiple frightened people. Of course, it's also true that all of them were in the same desperate position, facing the same court, with the same powerful incentive to say whatever the court wanted to hear, and the records were written down by the court's own clerks in Latin, shaped and summarized as they went. So the consistency cuts both ways. It always does in these trials. And then, across the 20th and 21st of October, two things happened in close succession, and the order in which they happened matters enormously to how you read everything that comes afterward. The court formally informed Gilles that torture had been authorized to draw the truth out of him. And Gilles, already excommunicated, now staring down the rack, facing judges who were simultaneously his political and financial enemies, broke and confessed. The confession, when it finally came, was not a flat, formulaic recitation of the charges. He wept openly. He begged the people assembled in the room to pray for him and for his soul. He described the killings in detail, said he had carried them out following no man's counsel but his own, solely for his own pleasure and carnal delight, and at one point reportedly said he had told them enough to hang 10,000 men. He pleaded to be received back into the church. He made a private confession to a priest. He requested burial at a Carmelite monastery in Nantes. On the 25th of October, he was sentenced, and on the 26th, he died on the meadow at the Ile de Biesse, hanged, and then given over to the fire, though at his own request his body was pulled from the flames before they could consume it, and was carried away for burial by a group of noblewomen who claimed it. His two servants, Henriette Griart and Poitou, were hanged beside him, and their bodies were left in the fire to burn all the way down to ash. The day itself, as the records describe it, had an almost ceremonial quality that sits very strangely against the charges. Gilles asked that there be a procession through the town before the execution, a religious procession, with the townspeople walking and singing and praying for the souls of the condemned men, and the town did it. He had arranged, in effect, his own send-off, and the people he had supposedly terrorized took part in it. He spoke to the crowd at the scaffold, exhorted his two servants to meet death well and keep their minds on God, and asked again and again to be remembered in their prayers. He went to his death as a penitent Christian going to a reconciled end, having confessed and been received back into the church he'd been cut off from days earlier. Whatever you make of his guilt, the man on that scaffold was not a defiant monster snarling at his accusers. He was performing contrition fully and publicly, and the audience went along with it. That dissonance, the confessed child killer leading a prayer procession to his own pyre, mourned by the parents of the dead, is the single hardest thing in the whole case to hold in your head, and no version of the story, guilty or framed, fully dissolves it. So that's the story the trial tells. A war hero turned monster. A man who descended through grief and greed and pride into alchemy, and from alchemy into the systematic, ritualized slaughter of children, caught almost by accident over an entirely unrelated outrage, who broke down and confessed everything, and then died a strangely penitent death. For most of the centuries since, that was simply the truth of Gilles de Rais, full stop. He became a figure of nightmare, a bogeyman to frighten children with. A number of folklorists believe he's part of where the fairy tale of Bluebeard comes from, the wealthy, charming lord with the locked room full of murdered innocents. But sit a while longer with the actual shape of that confession and with the conditions under which it was produced, because cracks start to appear. No bodies were ever found. The entire physical case amounted to ashes in fireplaces that everyone simply agreed must be the remains of children because the testimony said so. The confession itself came only after excommunication and only after the explicit formal threat of torture. And the men who extracted it, Bishop Malestroy chief among them, stood to benefit directly and enormously from Gilles' destruction. A man convicted of heresy forfeited his lands. Gilles' lands were vast, even diminished, and the powerful men of Brittany had been circling that wounded fortune for years, watching him sell it off piece by piece, waiting. After his death, pieces of his confiscated estates passed to the Duke of Brittany. Other pieces went to others close to the court. The men who judged him got paid in land for the verdict they reached. That is the crack that revisionists have been working at for a very long time, and it's not a frivolous one. Voltaire, back in the 18th century, already openly doubted the whole edifice. In the 20th century, several writers built sustained arguments that Gilles had been framed, that the trial was a judicial murder dressed in the robes of justice, a mechanism for seizing a bankrupt lord's remaining estates, while branding him a heretic and a child killer so thoroughly that no one would dare object to the seizure. The most famous modern eruption of that argument came in 1992, when a French writer organized a kind of mock retrial in Paris, assembling lawyers and politicians and public figures to re-examine the centuries-old case, and the gathering returned a verdict of not guilty. It made international headlines. It also carried precisely zero legal weight, mixed invented material in among the genuine evidence, as though there were no difference between them, and included essentially no actual qualified medieval historians on its panel. And the writer who staged the whole production later more or less conceded that it had been a stunt, a piece of theatre, even calling it a farce. Professional medievalists took it apart line by line, cataloguing the errors and the inventions. The revisionist case, when you lay it out fairly, isn't nothing. Look at who profited. The man convicted of heresy loses his lands to the church and the crown, and Gilles still owned a great deal of land. The Bishop of Nantes who ran the trial was also the Chancellor of Brittany, the most powerful political figure in the duchy, a man with every reason to want a troublesome, unstable, axe-wielding lord neutralized and his estates freed up. The Duke of Brittany, who had just fined Gilles an enormous sum over the Saint-Étienne affair, ended up with pieces of the confiscated property. Add in the absence of bodies, the confession produced only after excommunication and the threat of the rack, and a procedure that gave the accused essentially none of the protections we'd now consider basic, and you can sketch a version of events where a difficult, broke, embarrassing nobleman was destroyed by his enemies, and the child murder charges were the lurid wrapping that made the destruction unassailable. It's a coherent story. It has been told seriously by serious people. And when you ask those medievalists, the people who have actually spent their careers inside the surviving documents, the great majority of them still come down on the side of guilt. Not because they think the trial was fair, they will tell you flatly and without hesitation that it was not, that by any modern standard it was a procedural catastrophe run by men with a direct financial interest in the outcome, but because of what came before the confession. The parents, dozens of independent families, scattered across the region, spread across years, came forward to say that their children had gone to Gilles' household and never been seen again. And crucially, they were saying it before Gilles ever confessed, before the threat of torture was ever raised, in the course of an investigation that had begun over a completely separate crime and stumbled into the larger horror sideways. One historian put it about as plainly as it can be put, that the abduction of those boys is no mere rumor and that facts are stubborn things. Another, after conceding every single contradiction and every inflated number in the record, still concluded that you cannot reasonably bank on the innocence of Gilles de Rais. And a third, asked to describe him in plain modern language, called him simply a sadistic child murderer, and left it there. The strongest single point on the side of guilt is probably the timing of the parental testimony, so it's worth being clear about why. If the whole thing were a frame-up engineered by Malestroit to grab the lands, the cleanest way to do it would have been the heresy and demon charges alone. Those were enough to convict and confiscate, and they didn't require producing a single grieving family. The child murder accusations didn't make the land grab any more legally certain. What they did was require dozens of ordinary people, with no stake in Breton politics and no obvious reason to lie about something so terrible, to come forward and name a dead son. Frames are usually economical. They use the minimum that works. The sprawl of the parental testimony, gathered before the confession and pointing at the same household over a span of years, is the part that doesn't fit the tidy conspiracy, and it's the part that keeps most historians where they are. The honest position, the one the evidence actually supports, is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses to collapse into either clean story. The trial was rotten. The judges were enriched by the verdict. The confession emerged under conditions that would get it thrown out of any courtroom on earth today. And the man very probably did do the things they said he did, or a great many of them, because far too many grieving parents told far too consistent a story, far too early in the process for the whole thing to be invention. Both of those statements appear to be true at the same time. And that's exactly why Gilles de Rais will not sit still as either a simple villain or a simple victim of a frame-up. The documents won't let him be either one cleanly, and they never have. One last detail before we leave him, because it genuinely lingers. François Prelati, the man who ran the demon summonings, who stood in the candle-lit circle and told Gilles that Baron required the hands and hearts and eyes of children. Prelati was not executed. The church court sentenced him only to imprisonment, and he escaped. He surfaced later at another noble court, living under a false name, comfortable, employed as a captain, until he eventually got himself arrested again years afterward over a completely unrelated matter and was finally hanged for that. The sorcerer at the very heart of the alleged horror walked out of it alive and free. For years, the Marshal of France burned on a meadow. The man who allegedly told him a demon wanted children's hearts served a stretch in a cell, slipped out of it, reinvented himself, and lived comfortably under another name in another lord's service, until an entirely separate crime finally caught up with him and put a rope around his neck. You can make of that whatever you like, but it's the sort of thing that lodges in the mind and doesn't leave. Let's leave the meadow at Nantes now and travel a very long way east and several centuries further back, because the next mystery isn't about whether a man did terrible things. It's about whether the man existed at all. His name was Rurik, and an entire 1,000 years of Russian and Ukrainian history begin with him, or rather, begin with the story of him, which may not turn out to be quite the same thing. The dynasty that ruled the lands of the Rus, the line that built up Kiev and Novgorod and eventually gave rise to Moscow, that produced grand princes and then tsars in an unbroken succession right down to the very end of the 16th century, traced its own bloodline back to a single Viking warlord who supposedly arrived from across the Baltic around the year 862. Everything rests on him. The whole legitimacy of 7 centuries of rulers, the founding charter of a civilization, and almost the entirety of what we think we know about him comes from one single document, written down roughly 2.5 centuries after he was supposed to have lived and died. That document is the primary chronicle, the tale of bygone years, compiled in Kiev around the year 1113, traditionally credited to a monk named Nestor, and under the year 862, it lays out a story that is either one of the most consequential founding events in all of European history, or one of its most quietly successful pieces of political fiction. The Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north, the chronicle tells us, had been paying tribute to Varangians. That's the eastern word for the Norsemen, the Vikings who came raiding and trading from across the Baltic Sea, and at some point had risen up and driven them back out. And then, with the outsiders gone, the tribes had immediately fallen to fighting bitterly among themselves. Tribe against tribe, clan against clan, with no one able to impose order on the chaos. And so, the story goes, Worn down and exhausted by their own endless infighting, they made a collective decision that has struck a great many historians as just a little too tidy to be literally true. They sent messengers back across the sea to the Varangians and said, in the phrasing that every Russian schoolchild has known for generations, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us, come and reign." 3 brothers answered the call. Rurik, the eldest, who settled at Novgorod. The second brother, Cineas, who settled at a place called Beluzero. And the third, Truvor, who settled at Izborsk. Within 2 years, the chronicle says, both of the younger brothers were dead, and Rurik gathered all of their territory into his own hands alone, and began parceling out its towns and its authority to his most loyal followers. He ruled until the year 879, and when he died, he left behind an infant son named Igor and a kinsman named Oleg to govern in the boy's name until he came of age, and from that single bloodline descended every grand prince and every Tsar who mattered for the next 700 years of Eastern European history. It is a clean, satisfying, almost suspiciously well-shaped story. And historians have been pulling at the loose threads of it for a very long time, starting, naturally enough, with the 2 brothers who die so conveniently fast. The first thing to understand about the source is the gap. The events are dated to 862. The chronicle that records them was put together around 1113. That's roughly 2.5 centuries of distance, the equivalent for us of someone today writing the definitive account of events from the 1700s, based largely on stories that had been passed down by word of mouth. And the monk doing the writing wasn't a neutral observer. He was working in Kiev for a dynasty that wanted a clean and noble origin story in a Christian monastic tradition that liked its histories to carry moral and political shape. The 862 date itself is suspiciously precise for an event that supposedly emerged out of tribal chaos, and several of the chronicle's early dates appear to have been worked out backward, fitted to a framework, rather than recorded as they happened. None of that means the underlying story is false. It means the document is a polished artifact made long after the fact, and it has to be read as one. Because Cineas and Truvor have a real problem. They show up at the very beginning of the story. They oblige the narrative by dying almost immediately, so that Rurik can hold the whole inheritance alone and undivided. And then they leave essentially no fingerprint anywhere else in the historical or archaeological record. No excavated layer at the towns they supposedly ruled lines up cleanly with their presence in the 860s. And in the early 20th century, scholars looking hard at the 3 names through the lens of Old Norse noticed something genuinely unsettling. Read aloud, in the original Scandinavian, Rurik, Cineas and Truvor sounds remarkably close to Rurik, Cinehus and Tru Varing, which would translate roughly as Rurik, his house, and his loyal warriors, his kinsmen and his faithful armed retinue. In other words, the chronicler, writing 2.5 centuries after the fact, working from oral tradition in a language that was not his own, may have taken a phrase that originally meant something like, Rurik arrived with his household and his trusted guard, and accidentally split it into a man who arrived flanked by 2 brothers. Brothers who then, very tidily, died. It is an elegant theory, and it is also genuinely contested. Some linguists have pushed back on it hard, arguing that those reconstructed Norse phrases don't actually pass the way the theory needs them to, that the grammar and the morphology are simply wrong, that you can't get from the real Old Scandinavian to those names along that route. One prominent scholar of the Scandinavian presence in early Rus has argued flatly that the tidy his house and his retinue reading doesn't hold up against how the language actually worked, and that it's become popular more because it's clever and memorable than because it's sound. Other scholars have proposed instead that Cineas and Truvor might be real but badly garbled Norse personal names that the chronicler mangled in transcription, names like Singjot or similar that got bent out of shape passing through generations of oral retelling into a foreign alphabet. The truthful state of affairs is that we don't know, and the two brothers sit in that maddening zone of being probably not real as described, while nobody is able to slam the door on them completely. A celebrated Russian archaeologist who spent his entire working life digging in exactly the relevant ground concluded that the existence of Rurik's brothers seemed doubtful to him and pointed out, almost wearily, that the stone cross which gets shown to tourists at Izborsk as Truvor's grave was actually carved something like a century and a half after Truvor would have had to die. The grave is real enough. It's just centuries too young to belong to the man whose name is on it, like so much of this story. A solid object pointing at a person who may never have existed, the marker outlasting any proof of the thing it marks. Then there is the larger fight, the one that has never really been about pure scholarship and probably never can be. The question of whether the Rus, the founders of the entire thing, the people behind the name, were Scandinavians at all, or something else. This is the Normanist controversy, and it has been politically radioactive for the better part of 300 years now. In the 18th century, German scholars working at the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg argued that the Rus were Norsemen, that the Russian state had been founded by Vikings from across the sea. And a Russian polymath named Mikhail Lomonosov was so deeply personally offended by the notion that foreigners had founded Russia that he attacked the whole thesis with real fury, insisting that the Rus had been Slavs all along, and casting around for a Slavic river name to derive the word from instead. That argument has flared back up over and over again ever since, generation after generation, and you can usually read the political temperature of the region in any given decade by listening to how loud the anti-Normanist voices have gotten. National pride, imperial legitimacy, the competing, sometimes furious origin stories of modern nations that share the same medieval roots. All of it gets loaded onto the back of a 9th century warlord who, conveniently for everyone with an axe to grind, left behind no writing of his own and can therefore be made to mean almost anything. Strip the politics back off and look at what the surviving evidence actually says, though, and it points fairly consistently in one direction. The personal names recorded in the early treaties between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire, the ones signed in the early 900s, are overwhelmingly Norse names, Scandinavian through and through. A Byzantine emperor, writing a detailed manual of statecraft for his son, listed out the names of the rapids on the Dnieper River in two separate languages, the Slavic names and the Rus names side by side, and the Rus ones are plainly, recognizably Scandinavian. A Frankish chronicle from the year 839 describes a group of envoys of the Rose arriving at the imperial court and, upon questioning, turning out to be Swedes. Arab travelers and geographers who encountered the Rus directly described them as a people distinct from the Slavs, with their own customs, including one famous, harrowing eyewitness account of a Rus ship burial complete with the ritual killing of a slave girl, a ceremony that reads as straightforwardly, unmistakably Norse in every particular. That ship burial account, written down by an Arab diplomat who claimed to have watched it happen on the Volga, is worth pausing on because it's about as far from a dry textual argument as you can get. He describes the dead chieftain laid out in his boat, the drinking and the feasting, a slave girl who had agreed to die with her master, the things done to her over those days, and finally her killing and the burning of the whole ship and everyone in it, the smoke going up over the river. Whatever else you make of the man who wrote it down, the funeral he describes is a Scandinavian funeral, not a Slavic one. The Rus he met on the Volga were behaving like Norsemen far from home, and the ground itself agrees with the texts. At Staraya Ladoga, the old trading settlement up near where the rivers run down to meet the Baltic, archaeologists have uncovered Scandinavian-style buildings and Scandinavian goods dating back to the middle of the 700s, before the chronicle's tidy story even properly begins. At a site called Rurikovo Gorodishche, Rurik's fortified settlement, the genuine 9th century predecessor of Novgorod, sitting just a couple of kilometers from where the later great city would eventually rise. Excavators have pulled out Scandinavian brooches, Thor's hammer amulets, a little bronze Valkyrie figurine, Byzantine and Oriental coins, and the workshops and craft debris of a mixed Slavic and Norse population, clearly living and trading side by side in exactly the right window of years. The settlement the chronicle calls Novgorod, the name literally means new town, didn't even exist yet as a city centre in 862. The Rus stronghold of the story was Gorodishche, just down the river. The famous Novgorod came later and grew up alongside. And what came after Rurik, whoever he was, is on much firmer ground than Rurik himself. The chronicle says his kinsman Oleg took the infant Igor south down the rivers, took Kiev, and made it the center of the Rus. And Oleg and Igor are far better attested than the founder. They show up in those Byzantine treaties, in raids on Constantinople, in the hard documentary record of a real polity doing real things. The river route from the Baltic down to the Black Sea, the road the Norsemen were working, is archaeologically solid. A corridor of trade and tribute and slaving running through the heart of Eastern Europe, with Scandinavian material scattered all along it. So the structure the legend sits on top of is sound. Vikings really did come down those rivers. They really did take power over Slavic and Finnic peoples. They really did found the line that became the Grand Princes of the Rus. It's only the very first man, the named founder with the two convenient brothers and the formal invitation, who dissolves a little when you look at him too closely. So you end up landing in a strange and unsatisfying place with Rurik. The specific man, with his two doomed brothers and his neat formal invitation to come and rule, is almost certainly a legend. A founding story sanded down and shaped by a monk in Kiev, who had perfectly good reasons of his own to hand the ruling dynasty a clean and dignified Norse pedigree stretching back to a single noble founder. But the thing that the legend is built directly on top of, Scandinavian warlords carving out zones of power and tribute among the Slavic and Finnic peoples along the great river routes in the middle of the 9th century, that part is as real as the dirt it's still buried in. The legend is a face painted over something that genuinely happened. And there is one genuinely tantalizing candidate for a flesh and blood man behind the legendary Rurik, off in the Western European sources, where the Vikings happen to be much better documented than they are in the East. A Danish or Frisian Viking named Rurik of Dorestad. A real, attested figure who held lands from the Frankish emperor, who raided and ruled around the North Sea, who seized the great trading town of Dorestad, sacked the settlement at Hedeby, and looted Bremen. And then, right around the year 860, the Frankish chronicles abruptly lose track of him. He loses his lands and simply drops clean out of the Western written record for a stretch of years, at very nearly the exact moment that the Eastern Chronicle says its Rurik first appeared over in the Baltic. The name is, linguistically, the same name. The dates line up with a precision that's hard to wave away as coincidence. When Rurik of Dorestad eventually reappears in the Western sources later on, and is then noted as having died, even that timing isn't terribly far off from the Chronicle's own date for the death of Rurik. Nobody can prove the two men are one and the same. No surviving source draws the connection directly, with a line between them. But a documented, real Viking warlord who vanishes from one end of Europe at precisely the instant a Viking warlord bearing his own name appears at the other end, is exactly the sort of coincidence that historians find very hard to simply look away from. That's about as far as the evidence will honestly carry us, and where it carries us to is semi-legendary. A real historical phenomenon wearing what is probably an invented face, which is a deeply frustrating answer if what you wanted walking in was a clean yes or a clean no. And it's a genuinely fascinating one if you're willing to sit for a while with just how much of a nation's entire sense of its own beginnings can hang on a single sentence that a monk wrote down about something that happened generations before his own great-great-grandparents were ever born. The mystery of Rurik isn't really a whodunit. It's a question about how history gets made and remade, and who benefits from the shape it gets made into. And people did keep remaking it, long after the monk laid down his pen. The Rurikid dynasty ruled for 7 centuries on the strength of descent from this one half-glimpsed founder, and every grand prince and tsar in that line had a stake in his being real and noble and singular. When the dynasty finally died out at the end of the 16th century, and Russia fell into the chaos of disputed succession, the absence of a Rurikid heir was itself a crisis. The legitimacy that had flowed from that founding bloodline suddenly had nowhere to flow. Later rulers reached back for him too. The man got statues. He got monuments raised on the supposed anniversaries of his arrival. He became a figure that emperors and nationalists and rival modern nations could all claim or contest, each according to what they needed him to mean. A warlord who may never have set foot where the story puts him, who may be two real men fused together, or one real man heavily embroidered, or a phrase about a household misread as a family, ended up as the load-bearing wall of 1,000 years of identity. He left no words of his own, and so everyone else got to put words in his mouth. There's a strange kind of power in that, in being remembered precisely because you left so little behind that you could be made into anything. Now, from a mystery about whether a death even happened at all, to one where the deaths are not in any doubt whatsoever, only the sheer, grotesque, almost unbelievable indignity of them. For this one we travel to Germany, to the high summer of 1184, and to what is, without a great deal of competition, the single most undignified mass death of the nobility in the entire span of the Middle Ages. The town is Erfurt, in Thuringia, and the occasion that brought everyone together was supposed to be peace. Two powerful men had been feuding for some time, the Archbishop of Mainz, a man named Conrad, and the Landgrave of Thuringia, Ludwig III. And their quarrel had escalated to a point dangerous enough that the king himself decided he needed to step in and settle it personally before it spilled into open war. That king was Henry VI, the son of the great emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a young man of around 18 at the time, and he convened a formal assembly, a Hoftag, a court day, to bring the two enemies face to face and force a reconciliation between them under royal authority. He chose to hold the gathering in a building attached to the church complex on the Petersburg, the high ground rising over the town of Erfurt. The great and the good of the whole region came pouring in for it. Counts and bishops and burgraves, the landgrave and the archbishop themselves at the centre of it all, the king presiding, and a thick crowd of lesser nobles and local notables besides, every one of them packing into an upper room on the second floor of the building to witness the king broker peace between the two great rivals. The building had a wooden floor, and underneath the ground floor, exactly as was completely ordinary and unremarkable for a building of that era, there was a latrine, a cesspit, where the human waste of the household collected and sat, a deep one, and on this particular day, a full one. A word about that, because it matters for understanding how the deaths actually happened, and it's the part people tend to skip past. Medieval buildings of any size simply had these. A privy or a row of privies on an upper floor would empty down a shaft into a pit at the bottom, sometimes a stone-lined vault, sometimes just a deep hole, and the waste of everyone in the building would collect there for months or years, until somebody was paid the deeply unpleasant wage to dig it out. In a complex attached to a church, housing clergy and their households, and now hosting a royal assembly, that pit would have been large, and it would have been deep, and it would have been working hard. This was not a thin layer of muck, it was a reservoir. Years of accumulated filth, soft and deep and effectively bottomless to a man who fell into it in armor, the worst possible surface to land on, too liquid to break a fall, too thick to swim, too deep to stand. And the floor of the assembly room sat above it, with only the rotten support of old timber in between. The wooden support beams holding up that crowded second-story floor were, as the day would catastrophically reveal, rotten, or at the very least nowhere remotely near strong enough for what was about to be asked of them. As the room kept filling, with armoured, heavy, fully grown men pressing in shoulder to shoulder to get a view of the proceedings, the load on those beams built and built and built. Wood under that kind of strain doesn't always announce itself. There may have been a crack, a groan, a half-second where the men nearest the sound looked down. And then, at some point on the 26th of July, the beams gave way all at once. The entire floor collapsed, and the falling mass of timber and bodies did not politely stop at the ground floor below. It smashed straight through that level as well, the weight of dozens of men and the broken floor above driving down through the lower boards, and dumped the assembled nobility of Thuringia directly down into the cesspit beneath the building. What happened next is the part that the chroniclers fixed on, and it is, with no exaggeration at all, one of the very worst ways to die recorded anywhere in the medieval sources. Some of the men were killed outright by the fall itself, or crushed to death beneath the weight of the collapsing timbers. But a great many of them survived the drop, only to land alive in several feet of liquid human waste, in a confined and lightless pit, with shattered debris and other thrashing, panicking men falling and piling on top of them in the dark. And there, the accounts tell us, they drowned, or they suffocated, in sewage. Counts and knights and lords who had survived pitched battles, who wore their high rank like a second skin, who had spent their whole lives at the top of the order of things, died choking and flailing in the accumulated filth of a latrine pit, while the survivors up above them could do nothing at all but stand at the broken edge of the floor and listen to it happen. The chronicler Arnold of Lübeck set the number of dead nobles at around 60. Other accounts run higher, past 100, once you fold in all the attendants and servants and lesser men who went down into the pit alongside their masters. The records preserve the names of some of the great ones who died there. Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, Count Gosmar of Ziegenhain, the Burgrave Friedrich of Kirchberg, Friedrich of Abenberg, Count Burchard, and a handful of others, and then, in the cold and characteristic manner of the medieval chronicle, they note that many more men of lesser name perished there too, unrecorded and uncounted, a miserable death in the muck, their names not thought worth the ink. You can actually trace the aftermath of the disaster through the property records, which is its own quiet kind of horror. The estates of the dead counts genuinely changed hands in the months that followed, passing to brothers and daughters and sons. The ordinary machinery of inheritance grinding into motion over men who had drowned in a sewer. It's worth lingering on a couple of those names because they turn the body count back into people. Heinrich of Schwarzburg left no son to follow him, so his lands passed to his brother, and a whole branch of a powerful Thuringian family pivoted on a rotten beam. Gosmar of Ziegenhain left a daughter, who carried his inheritance into a marriage that tied it, of all places, to the family of the Landgrave whose feud had called the assembly together in the first place. So the quarrel that killed him eventually folded his estate into the household of one of the two men it had been convened to reconcile. Friedrich of Kirchberg, the Burgrave, left a son who took up his title. These were not abstractions. They were men with households and heirs and ongoing lawsuits and plans for the autumn, and they went up the hill at Erfurt on a July morning to watch the king settle an argument, and the floor opened under them. The disaster reshuffled the map of who held what across a stretch of Germany, all at once, by accident, in an afternoon. The king lived. Henry VI had been seated, along with the Archbishop of Mainz, in a stone window alcove, a niche built directly into the masonry of the wall itself, which, being stone rather than rotten wood, did not collapse when the floor gave way. The two of them clung there, wedged into the recess, suspended above the carnage below, while the entire rest of the room dropped away beneath their feet. The Archbishop is said to have held on tight to the window frame, and there the two most important men in the building stayed, pinned into their small, surviving fragment of the world, until people could rush to find ladders and bring them safely down. Both of the men whose feud had caused the assembly to be summoned in the first place, the Archbishop and the Landgrave both, survived the collapse. The young king who had come specifically to make peace between them survived it too. Dozens of the people who had merely turned up to watch the great men reconcile did not. And Henry left Erfurt almost immediately afterward, the original quarrel he had ridden in to settle not even resolved that day. All of those men had died in a sewer for a peace conference that adjourned without a peace. Henry VI went on to a hard and consequential reign. He inherited the empire from his father Barbarossa, made himself king of Sicily through a brutal campaign, held the captured English King Richard the Lionheart for an enormous ransom, and died young, at 31, of a fever, leaving behind the infant who would grow up to be the famous Frederick II. He is remembered for a great many things, that emperor, and tucked among them, never quite scrubbed off, is the fact that as a teenager he survived the day the floor of Erfurt fell into the cesspit and took the flower of Thuringian nobility down with it. He spent the rest of his life as the man who'd been wedged in the window. Whatever else he did, the chroniclers never forgot where he'd been standing when the great men drowned in the dark below him. The story was simply too grimly perfect not to grow in the retelling, and by the 19th century it had collected the usual barnacles of folklore. One version that eventually got written down has Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, one of the men who died in the pit, being known in life for a particular reckless oath, that if such and such were true, then he'd be willing to drown in a privy. And then, the story goes, meeting exactly and precisely that end, the curse of his own careless mouth coming due on him in the most literal way imaginable. It's a wonderful, terrible little story. It is also almost certainly a later embroidery, the sort of neat moralizing detail that attaches itself to a famous disaster decades or centuries after the fact, something the human mind loves to add because it makes a senseless horror feel like it meant something. The chronicles closest to the actual event don't tell it that way. What they tell, soberly and without the folklore, is bad enough on its own. A floor packed with the powerful, a rotten beam, a pit beneath. There's a detail in some of the accounts that stuck with German memory for a reason, that the men who survived up at the broken edge of the floor, the king included, had to stand there while the dying went on below them, and there was nothing to be done quickly. Rescue meant ladders, ropes, men willing to climb down into the pit, and all of that takes time. And time was exactly what the men drowning in the dark did not have. By the time anyone reached the bottom, most of what could be pulled out was bodies. The Great Peace Conference of 1184 ended with the surviving nobility of Thuringia hauling the corpses of their friends and rivals out of a cesspit by lantern light, and then going home to bury them and divide their lands. The king rode away. The feud he'd come to settle rolled on, and the building's name, the Petersburg, kept its place on the map as if nothing had happened there at all. I'll say one quiet thing about the sources before we move on from Erfurt, only because it bears on how much we should trust the vivid texture of it. Every account we have of the disaster was written down after the fact, some of it decades later, and none of it by anyone who was actually standing in that room when the floor went. The broad event itself is not in any serious doubt. Too many independent chronicles record it. The political fallout is traceable, and the estates of the dead counts demonstrably changed hands. But the most vivid specifics, the exact mechanics of who clung to which window, who said precisely what, reach us second-hand, through writers reconstructing a horror that they had only ever heard about, which somehow makes the whole thing land harder rather than softer. That the event was notorious enough, memorable enough, to be told and retold across Germany for generations afterward, the great Latrine death of 1184, a standing warning about pride and about rotten foundations that, unusually, didn't require anyone to invent its moral. The moral was just sitting there in the facts, at the bottom of the pit. From a German cesspit, we go to a Polish cathedral, and from a medieval death to a medieval king whose real reach, if you want to put it that way, only extended itself almost 500 years after he was put in the ground. This one begins as an ordinary piece of conservation work on an old tomb and turns into something much closer to a horror story with a laboratory waiting at the end of it. Casimir IV Jagiellon was, while he was alive, one of the most successful rulers that Poland ever produced. Born in 1427, he became Grand Duke of Lithuania while still a boy and then King of Poland, and he held that demanding double crown for decades on end. His great signature achievement was a long, grinding, miserable war against the Teutonic Knights, the crusading military order that had carved out a powerful state for itself along the Baltic coast. And his eventual victory in that war brought Royal Prussia and the immense, wealthy port city of Gdansk back under the Polish crown and reduced what remained of the Teutonic state to the status of a vassal. That war ran for 13 years, a long, expensive slog that nearly broke the crown's finances and tested Casimir's patience and his nobles' loyalty over and over. And he held it together and came out the other side with the most important strategic prize in the region. He married Elizabeth of Austria, and together the two of them had 13 children, and Casimir spent the later part of his long reign methodically placing his many sons on the thrones of half of Central Europe, Bohemia, Hungary, Poland, Lithuania. The dynasty he fathered became, for a time, one of the genuinely dominant royal houses on the entire continent. His bloodline spread across a string of crowns. He was, by the standards of medieval kingship, a winner, patient, calculating, dynastically ruthless in the ordinary way, and largely victorious. He died in 1492, the same year, as it happens, that ships were leaving Spain for the far side of the Atlantic, and was buried in the Wawel Cathedral in Krakow, the great royal church standing on the hill above the city, the coronation and burial place of Polish kings, beneath a magnificent red marble tomb carved by Veit Stoss, one of the finest sculptors working anywhere in Europe at the time. The canopied monument, all sharp, late Gothic stonework and mourning figures. He died in summer, in the heat, and his body began to decay quickly, so they buried him in some haste, in a relatively simple wooden coffin, the corpse wrapped up and treated with resin and cloth to manage the corruption. A small, practical, faintly grim detail of the burial that absolutely no one had any reason to think about again for 481 years. In April of 1973, a team of 12 men obtained permission to open his tomb. The cathedral wanted conservation work carried out, the great red marble monument restored and stabilized. And the only way to do that work properly and thoroughly was to open up the burial itself and deal directly with the remains inside it. The permission came from the Archbishop of Krakow at the time, a man named Karol Wojtyła, who, just a few years later, would be elected Pope John Paul II, a detail that lends the whole episode its own additional layer of strangeness in hindsight. On the 13th of April, which happened to fall on a Friday, the team opened the tomb. It was careful, scholarly work, not grave robbing. Historians, conservators, a documentary impulse to learn what was actually inside a royal burial that old. They lifted the heavy marble slab. They eased open the decayed wooden coffin. Inside they found the long decayed remains of the king, the resin-soaked cloth gone dark and brittle, the bones, the dust and the corruption of very nearly 5 full centuries sealed inside a stone box. They handled the remains, photographed and measured and recorded, leaning in close over the open coffin in the still air of the crypt, breathing the air that came up out of it. They carried out their conservation work, documented everything carefully, and that autumn the king and his queen were reinterred with a proper and dignified ceremony, Wojtyła himself presiding over it. As far as anyone in that crypt knew, it had been a good day's work on an important piece of the national heritage. Nobody had any reason to think the air itself had been the danger. And then the men who had opened the tomb began to die. Within roughly a year of the opening, an architect on the team was dead, then a second member of the team, then a third, then a fourth. The deaths came clustered enough over 1974 and into 1975 that the people who had been in that crypt could hardly miss the pattern, one after another. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder over the king's coffin, gone. Over the following months and years, the deaths kept accumulating until, by the most commonly cited account, 10 of the 12 men who had opened that tomb had died prematurely, several of them within a strikingly short window of the work itself. The Polish press did precisely what you would expect any press anywhere to do with a set of facts like that. They reached straight for the single most famous tomb story in the entire world, the curse of the pharaohs, the string of deaths that had supposedly stalked Howard Carter's team after they cracked open the grave of Tutankhamun back in 1922. The patron dead within months of a mosquito bite gone bad, the lights of Cairo flickering, the whole legend that had sold newspapers for 50 years. And now Poland had its own homegrown version of it. The Curse of the Jagiellons. A Krakow journalist eventually wrote a best-selling book built around the legend. The story took deep hold, and you can still find it told today, confidently, as a straightforward tale of a long-dead king reaching out of his red marble box to strike down the men who had disturbed his rest. The trouble with a really good curse, though, is that it has a way of dissolving the moment someone actually sits down and investigates it properly. And a microbiologist did exactly that. His name was Bolesław Smyk, and he was connected to the tomb work, and he went looking for something a great deal more boring, and at the same time a great deal more genuinely frightening than a curse. He found a fungus, Aspergillus flavus, a mold that thrives in dark, sealed organic environments, which is to say, in precisely the conditions you would expect to find inside a centuries-old coffin, packed with decayed human tissue and resin-soaked cloth. And Aspergillus flavus produces toxins, aflatoxins, substances that are savagely poisonous to the human liver and that rank among the more potent natural carcinogens that science has identified. The same compounds that turn up on moldy grain and badly stored nuts and cause mass poisonings when they get into the food supply. The same mold also causes a serious and sometimes fatal lung disease in people who inhale enough of its spores, with the gravest danger falling on anyone whose immune system or general health is already compromised in some way. It is, in other words, exactly the sort of organism you would least want to breathe a concentrated lungful of in a confined space. And the conditions inside Casimir's coffin were close to ideal for it. Remember that the king had been buried fast. In summer, his decaying body wrapped and packed with resin and cloth, then sealed inside a stone monument and left undisturbed for nearly 5 centuries. Dark, still, organic, undisturbed, a slow incubator. Whatever had taken hold in there had had 481 years to grow, and to dry, and to turn to dust, and to wait. The moment the lid came off and the air moved, the dust moved with it. 12 men leaned in over an open box and breathed. The theory that came out of that microbiological work is essentially the very same theory that had earlier been floated about the tomb of Tutankhamun. The men who opened the burial breathed in a cloud of toxic fungal spores that had been sealed up and slowly concentrating in the airless dark for the better part of 500 years. And some of them paid for that single breath with their health and, eventually, with their lives. The damage manifesting over the months and the years that followed, rather than dropping anyone where they stood. Smyk himself was one of the survivors of the team, and he reportedly suffered lingering health problems for a very long time afterward. Balance disorders among them, a man who'd looked into the thing closely and carried something out of that crypt in his own body. What makes the fungal explanation persuasive rather than just convenient is that it fits the timing far better than the curse does. A supernatural curse in the storybook version kills fast and dramatically. The disturber struck down within days, the wrath immediate. Aflatoxin and fungal lung disease do not work like that. They work slowly. The liver damage accumulates. The lung infection sets in over weeks and worsens over months. A man might feel run down, then unwell, then seriously ill, the decline stretching across a year or more before it finished him. And a doctor in the mid-1970s, looking at one middle-aged man with liver failure and another with a wasting respiratory illness, would have had little reason to connect them to a tomb opened the previous spring. The deaths came spaced out exactly the way slow poisoning spaces them out, not the way a curse is supposed to. So the science actually explains the real pattern of the deaths more accurately than the legend does. The legend just explains the dread better. And dread, in the end, is what spread, because a journalist writing about a king's curse sells a great many more books than a microbiologist writing about Aspergillus flavus, even when the microbiologist is the one telling the truth. It's a satisfying answer. A real physical, biological cause hiding quietly inside a supernatural story, the mold beneath the curse. And it is probably at least partly true. The fungus was genuinely present in the tomb. Aspergillus flavus is genuinely dangerous, and sealed historical tombs genuinely can and do harbor it. But the curse story needs exactly the same skeptical eye that everything else in this video has needed, because the legend has been polished up well past what the actual facts can bear the weight of. The dramatic claim, repeated in countless retellings, that men dropped dead within mere days of the opening simply doesn't survive contact with the real timeline, in which the very first death on the team came something closer to a full year after the tomb was opened. The body count gets quietly inflated in some versions of the tale, climbing from 10 up to 15 or even higher by folding in anyone connected to the tomb or to the conservation laboratory who happened to die over the course of the following years, which, given enough years, is something that will happen to absolutely any group of 12 people on Earth, curse or no curse. And nobody working in 1973 actually had the scientific tools to prove that fungal toxins, rather than ordinary bad luck and the ordinary background rate of human mortality, had killed any specific member of the team. The fungus was real. The proof of what it did to any one man was, and remains, much thinner. The broader version of this idea, the Tutankhamun curse that the Casimir story is so clearly modelled on, has actually been studied properly, with real rigour, in a way the Polish case never quite was. A researcher went carefully through the Westerners who had been present at the opening of Tut's tomb and compared how long each of them went on to live against a control group of comparable people who hadn't been anywhere near it. And the study found no meaningful difference at all. The people who had supposedly been exposed to the curse of the pharaoh's tomb lived, on average, just about exactly as long as everybody else did. The figures came out within a few years of each other, well inside the range of ordinary chance. The most famous early death in the Tutankhamun story, the patron who funded the dig, died of an infected insect bite turned to blood poisoning, which is a thing that killed plenty of people in the 1920s who had never been near a tomb in their lives. The curse, studied as a question of who actually died and when, more or less evaporates. So the most honest way to hold the Casimir story in your hands is this. The fungus was real, and the danger from it was real. A sealed medieval tomb is, in a genuine and quietly unsettling sense, a small sealed chamber of slow biological poison. And opening one is not a thing that anyone should ever do casually or without protection. Modern archaeologists working on old burials take the spore risk seriously, with masks and ventilation, precisely because of cases like this. But the clean and chilling tale of a dead king reaching up out of his red marble box to kill the 12 men who disturbed his 500-year sleep is a story that we built collectively on top of a mold. Because a mold, however genuinely lethal it might be, somehow never quite feels like enough to account for the deep, primal dread of standing inside an opened grave. We wanted the king to be doing it. A fungus is just chemistry. A king's curse is a story, and stories are what we reach for when we're standing in the dark over an old dead man and the air shifts. The last one is the strangest of all of them, but strange in a completely different key, because the mystery this time isn't a death or a man or a disaster. It's an object. A single red stone, roughly the size of a small hen's egg, that has sat near the very front of the English crown for centuries, soaked all the way through with a history of murder, and that isn't even, when you get right down to it, the thing that everyone has confidently called it for the past 600 years. It's known as the Black Prince's ruby, and it is not a ruby. It sits today in the imperial state crown of the British monarchy, set into the cross at the very front of the crown, mounted directly above one of the great diamonds that were cut from the enormous Cullinan stone. It's large and irregular and polished into a smooth, rounded, dome-like shape rather than cut into the sharp geometric facets we associate with modern gems, and it glows a deep, warm, arterial red. And for the overwhelming majority of its long life, absolutely everyone who looked at it simply assumed it was an enormous ruby, one of the most valuable rubies in the entire world. It was only in the 18th century that the science of mineralogy finally advanced far enough to tell the genuine difference, and the difference turned out to be a real and fundamental one. The stone is a spinel, a red spinel, a barless ruby, in the old vanished language of the gem trade, which is a completely different mineral that simply happens to emerge from the ground in the very same glorious shade of red. For centuries, any large red gem at all got loosely called a ruby, and this particular spinel fooled a whole succession of kings and crown jewelers. It was almost certainly mined high in the mountains of Badakhshan in Central Asia, the old and famous source of the great Balas stones, and from there it began a long journey westward, a journey that runs directly through some genuinely horrifying history. The confusion is forgivable, honestly. To the naked eye, a fine red spinel and a fine ruby are nearly indistinguishable. The same deep red, the same fire under candlelight, the same heft in the hand. They form in similar places, deep in the same kinds of rock. And for most of human history, nobody had any way of telling them apart beyond instinct and trade law. They're different minerals down at the level of their crystal structure and chemistry, but you can't see that without the tools, and the tools didn't exist. So some of the most famous rubies in the world turned out, once the science caught up, to be spinels in disguise. This stone is the most celebrated example, but it's far from the only royal gem that quietly changed categories the moment a mineralogist got a proper look at it. Whole inventories of the great red jewels of Europe had to be silently revised. The Black Prince's ruby kept its name anyway, because by then, the name was worth more than the accuracy. A Bala Spinel with 600 years of murder behind it doesn't need to be a literal ruby to be priceless. The stone's documented life begins in the 1360s in Granada, the last surviving Muslim kingdom in Spain, and it begins, fittingly, in blood. It belonged to a sultan of Granada, a man who had taken the throne for himself in the first place by murdering his predecessor, and who was known by a nickname that translated roughly as the Red. Granada in those years was a viper's nest of palace coups, the Nasrid throne changing hands by assassination and counter-assassination, brothers and cousins and in-laws cutting each other down inside the most beautiful palace in Europe. The Red Sultan had won his turn at the top the usual way, with a knife, and he held it for a few years. When this sultan's own grip on power began to slip, when a rival, the man he had deposed, backed now by the powerful Christian kingdom of Castile, was steadily closing in on him, the Red Sultan fled the great palace fortress of the Alhambra and carried away with him as much of the royal treasure as he could physically manage, the great red stone among it, and threw himself on the mercy of the King of Castile. That king was Pedro I, the man whom history would come to remember, not without cause, as Pedro the Cruel. It was a catastrophic decision, and the Sultan seems to have walked into it almost blind, without securing any guarantee of safe conduct, trusting that a fellow monarch would treat a royal guest as a royal guest. Pedro wanted the treasure for himself, and Pedro was, as it happened, already allied with the very rival that the fleeing Sultan was running away from. According to the Castilian chronicle that records the affair, Pedro received the Sultan and his company, and then had them seized. He had the Sultan's companions killed, and then, on a plain just outside Seville, a stretch of open ground used for displays and executions, he killed the Sultan himself. By some accounts, Pedro ran him through personally with a lance, the King of Castile spilling the blood of his own guest with his own royal hands in front of an audience. Dozens of the man's entourage were slaughtered there alongside him. Hundreds more of his followers were taken prisoner, and the account states poisoned to death later on, the whole party wiped out in stages. Pedro had the dead Sultan's severed head cut off and sent to the rival back in Granada as a kind of grisly diplomatic gift, a token of the new alliance, proof of services rendered. And the great red stone, taken either off the body itself or out of the baggage of the murdered, beheaded man, passed quietly into Pedro the Cruel's possession, one more piece of a treasure that had now cost its owner his head. It did not remain there for very long, and the manner in which it left his hands is the part of the story that gave the stone its eventual English name. Pedro the Cruel soon had a serious civil war of his own to deal with. His illegitimate half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, rising up to come for the throne, and Pedro turned to England for military help. Specifically, he turned to Edward of Woodstock, the eldest son of the English king, the prince remembered down the centuries as the Black Prince. widely regarded as the most celebrated and formidable soldier of his entire generation, the victor of Poitiers, the terror of France. The Black Prince brought an English army down across the Pyrenees into Spain and won a crushing, decisive victory for Pedro at the Battle of Nájera in 1367, scattering Henry's forces and putting Pedro back on his throne. It was a brilliant campaign and a ruinous one. The English army sickened in the Spanish heat, and the Black Prince himself is thought to have picked up there the illness that would dog him for the rest of his life and eventually kill him, years later, a slow, wasting decline that took one of the great warriors of the age to his bed and kept him there. And then Pedro couldn't, or simply wouldn't, pay what the enormously expensive campaign had actually cost. So, as payment, or at least as part of it, the Black Prince took the great Balas ruby, the very stone that had been pulled off the body of a murdered, beheaded sultan only a few years earlier, and carried it back home with him to England. 2 years after all of that, Pedro was murdered by his half-brother Henry regardless, stabbed to death in a tent, by some accounts with Henry's own hands on him. The whole bloody Spanish enterprise having bought him nothing in the end but a little additional time and an ally who went home broke and dying. From England, the stone steps into royal legend, and the legend grows dramatic, though some parts of it stand on much firmer ground than others. It is said that Henry V wore the stone at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, set into the gem-encrusted crown that ringed his steel battle helmet, and that during the savage fighting a French duke struck the king a tremendous blow to the head with an axe, hard enough to break a piece clean off the crown, and that the king and the stone both somehow came through it intact. That's the story as it's told. It's a good one, and the blow to Henry's helmet at Agincourt is reasonably well attested in the sources. The king did fight in the press, did take a hit to the head heavy enough to damage the crown welded around his helm, and did survive it. Exactly which jewels were mounted precisely where, though, is the sort of fine detail that tends to grow firmer and more confident in the retelling than the actual surviving evidence can really support. The image of this specific stone, a gem that had already watched one king murder another's guest, riding into the worst hour of Agincourt on the head of the most famous English king of the age, and taking an axe blow and shrugging it off, is exactly the sort of detail that a stone's legend wants to be true, whether or not the record can prove it. The very same stone is sometimes also said to have been worn by Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the battle where Richard was cut down and killed, and where the English crown was supposedly afterward pulled out of a thorn bush by Lord Stanley and set on the head of the first Tudor king. But that particular claim is rather more tradition than it is documentation. What is solid and traceable is that a great Balas ruby threads its way through the official inventories of the English crown for century after century, set into one royal crown after another in succession. It appears in the records of the Tudor kings, listed among the most valuable single stones in the realm. At some point it was drilled straight through with a small hole so that it could be worn as a hanging pendant, a common enough practice with large Asian gems of the period, which often reached Europe already pierced for stringing, And that drilled hole is still there in the stone to this very day, plugged now with a tiny genuine ruby to fill the gap. The spinel survived the closest thing England ever came to losing its crown jewels entirely, when the monarchy was abolished in the 17th century, and Oliver Cromwell's revolutionary government broke up the royal regalia, melted down all the gold into coin, and sold off the loose stones to whoever would buy them. The medieval crowns of England were destroyed in that purge, smashed up and weighed out as bullion, the continuity of centuries deliberately broken. The great red spinel, one of the most storied gems in Europe, a stone that had passed through the hands of murdered sultans and warrior princes and conquering kings, was valued in that sale at the frankly contemptuous sum of £4, which tells you just about everything you need to know about how little the men doing the selling cared for the centuries of bloody history they happened to be holding in their hands. To them it was a lump of red, glass-looking rock with a price on it, and yet, somehow, it found its way back. After the monarchy was restored, a large red stone was bought back for the crown, almost certainly the very same one, recovered from wherever the upheaval had scattered it, and it has remained in the regalia ever since. It came through a serious fire at the Tower of London in the 19th century, when the jewels had to be snatched out of the flames. It was carefully hidden away for safekeeping through the dangers of 2 world wars, tucked out of sight while bombs fell. There's a quiet irony in the name the stone ended up keeping when you follow the Black Prince's own thread to its end. Edward of Woodstock, the great soldier who carried the gem home from Spain, never became king. The illness he picked up on that Spanish campaign, the one the stone was payment for, wore him down for years, a slow physical decline that kept the most admired warrior in Christendom increasingly confined and ailing, and he died in 1376, a year before his own father, with the English throne still ahead of him and now forever out of reach. The crown he might have worn passed instead to his young son, who became Richard II and was eventually deposed and died a prisoner. So the stone outlived the prince it's named for, and the prince's father, and the prince's son's reign, the way it has outlived everyone. It doesn't carry his name because he was its bloodiest owner. He just happened to be the one who brought it into the story of England, and the story of England is the one that stuck. And now it sits exactly where it has sat in living memory, mounted at the very front of the imperial state crown, glowing the same deep arterial red that it glowed back when it was first taken off the body of a murdered sultan on a plain outside Seville. The monarch wears it at coronations, and again every year to open Parliament. Most of the people who lay eyes on it, in photographs or in person at the Tower of London, where the crown jewels are kept on permanent display behind thick glass, look at the stone and see a ruby. A famous, ancient, romantic ruby, with the dashing name of a chivalric warrior prince attached to it. And they're wrong on both counts, in their own way. It isn't a ruby at all, and the prince it happens to be named for is very nearly the least bloody figure in its whole long and murderous biography. The real history sealed up inside that stone is a usurper who murdered his way onto a throne, a fleeing sultan run through with a lance and then beheaded for the sake of his own treasure, an entourage slaughtered and a few hundred followers quietly poisoned, a hard-won fortune that ultimately bought not one single person any lasting safety at all, and a red gem that has now outlived every single hand that ever closed possessively around it, and that is still here, still red, still perched right at the top of a crown, patiently waiting out the next set of hands that will reach for it. And that's where I'll set it down for tonight. 5 old puzzles, none of them tied off the way we'd want. If one of them is going to follow you around for a day or two, I'd put my money on the meadow at Nantes, but I've been wrong before. Tell me down below which one stuck. That's half the fun of doing these, reading what you all make of them. New faces, hit subscribe if the mood takes you. Everyone else, you already know the drill. Get some rest. Be decent to the people around you, and I'll be right here when the next one's ready. See you then.